because toxicology is so complicated, we're just going to focus on one particular drug, and that's going to be alcohol. One, it's very relevant in our society, but also it sort of limits the concepts of what toxicologists do. We can get an example of the challenge of their job and what it entails without all the complexity about all the different possibilities of drugs. So, this is basically what I'm saying is alcohol is the most abused drug in our Western country. And again, when we say abused, right, it is legal, but it's still heavily abused. About 17,000 traffic deaths occur each year attributed to effects of alcohol intoxication. And so this becomes this good representative example of how the metabolism of alcohol affects detection of alcohol in the body. Alcohol is a fancy name for ethyl alcohol. There's actually many kinds of alcohols chemically, but we're going to focus on the one that, we're all, that's the drinking and driving drug is ethyl alcohol. So it's colorless liquid, normally diluted with water and consumed. Like any depressant, it will depress all the central nervous system and especially the brain. And the blood alcohol concentration is definitely shown to be directly proportional to the concentration of alcohol in the brain, which is where it does its effects. So if we can measure it elsewhere in the body, we can assume that it's the same concentration in the brain, and that becomes important. So there's three general tasks to sets to metabolism, and this is true for all drug metabolism, but we'll talk about alcohol. One is the absorption. How does the drug get into the body and into, in this particular case, the bloodstream? And then second is distribution. Once it gets into the bloodstream at one point, then it has to get to all parts of the body. So there's the absorb in, then distribute across the whole body, and then the elimination. How does it get out of the body? So in the absorption process, we're going to talk about each of these processes one at a time. In the absorption process, the alcohol appears in the blood within minutes. Then it slowly increases in concentration. So a little bit of it gets into the blood right away, but it takes a while for it to all get into the bloodstream. Remember, it's absorbed into the stomach, right? We normally ingest this as a food, and so it's absorbed into the stomach. And depending on what is in the stomach, and depending on what else is in the stomach, depending on are we eating it with other foods, it gets absorbed into the blood through the small intestine. So it's in our stomach, goes into the small intestine, and from there, that's how it gets actually crossed over from the intestinal tract into the bloodstream. On average, alcohol is absorbed entirely into the bloodstream within an hour. So, somewhere between 30 and 90 minutes. It depends on different people, and it also depends on how much you've had. So about an hour if you're drinking on an empty stomach, about 3 hours if you're on a full stomach. So that absorption rate is very critically dependent on how much food is in your stomach. And we're going to see that effects of that later on. Other factors are what type of alcohol, if there's a carbohydrate associated with it as well. So in other words, beer tends to have a lot of carbs with it as well. And so the carbohydrates that come along with the alcohol, again, slow it down. It's a similar effect to having food in your stomach. It sort of ends up slowing that absorption rate. And also how quickly you consume it. If you consume it in a very short duration, that's going to increase how quickly it gets absorbed into the system. If you're drinking a little bit at a time and you're drinking over a duration of a half an hour, that starts to, draw out the absorption timeline. The slower the rate of absorption, the lower the peak blood alcohol content. Because remember, these three things are going to be happening all at once: absorbing in, distributing, and eliminating. So if it's a slow absorbing, and then as soon as it starts absorbing, it's also starting to eliminate, I never quite get up to my peak absorption level. If you have a very fast absorption rate before the elimination process has started, then what we see is that you can get a very high blood alcohol content. So how does it distribute through the body? For the most part, once it's absorbed in through the small intestine, it becomes uniformly distributed as our blood goes all around through our body. All of the watery portions of our body and that's most of our body. About 2/3 of our body is water. So all of that is going to get distributed. So through our blood system, but then our bloods go into the cells, and so it will go into the watery portion of all the cells. If you, after somebody has died who has consumed alcohol, if blood is not, the blood is not accessible to be able to test, or other watery portions, you can test things like the parts of the brain and the cerebral spinal fluid, the fluid in the spinal column, or the vitreous humor that's a part of the eyeball. And that can be used to detect alcohol levels. It's not the optimal choice, but if somebody has died, that may be the only option they have left. If the blood has coagulated and they can't test it. Urine is not part of the circulatory system, so it actually won't get us a good blood alcohol content. Remember, blood alcohol would be part of the blood system. And so urine is part of our excretory system. It doesn't work. So we can't use urine tests to detect accurately the blood alcohol content, which is the one that's going to affect what is the alcohol in the brain. So how do you eliminate alcohol? Most of the alcohol is eliminated through oxidation. So just like we burn all the other calories we consume, our body can burn the alcohol in a chemical process called oxidation. So that's 95%. It just has to go through this chemical process. Most of it's happening in our liver. Excretion is, sometimes you just sweat it out or you pee it out. So some of it just goes out and it never was oxidized, but most of it exits our system through oxidation. And again, that oxidation is taking place almost entirely in the liver, and it involves an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase. It's converting alcohol to acetic acid and then into carbon dioxide and water. So eventually, it's kind of like the fuel in your car. You have this fuel, it gets turned into carbon dioxide and water. It goes through an in-between process of being converted to acetic acid. And again, it involves this enzyme. I want you to know the concept. It's happening in the liver, and then it eventually makes CO2 and water. And then excretion would be, I detect it in the urine. And as we just said, we wouldn't use urine tests because only 5% of it exits the body in that way. So I'm really not going to get effective testing. But it would be still alcohol just leaving the body. It also can leave the body as sweat and a little bit as breath. So the blood alcohol concentration is something we will refer to a lot, and that's going to be determined as percent of the weight per volume. We won't worry too much about that, but the idea is that 0.10% means 0.10 grams per 100 milliliters of blood, and that will affect how people do the calculations. We're going to do a sample calculation in class. The elimination or the burn-off rate varies, but a general one we can use is 0.015% per hour. That, again, there's factors that would change that, but if we just want to get an estimate of how much time is it going to take for you to oxidize a certain amount of alcohol in the blood, we can say about 0.015% per hour. So if your blood alcohol level is 0.10, and I divide that by 0.015, it's about 6.5 hours to come down to zero, to fully oxidize all of that alcohol in your system. We had said this earlier, so again, these are we're not seeing the distribution, we're seeing the absorption rate and the elimination rate. Absorption rate is coming into the body, into the blood. The elimination rate is exiting the body, either through urination, perspiration, or through oxidation. And we see that these are kind of like two competing things. One's making it increase, one's making it decrease. On an empty stomach with a very fast, steep absorption rate, note that I get to a very high peak level. This peaks out at 100. This is in milligrams per 100, so this is not in blood alcohol content percent, but it's up at 100. It's definitely big. And then I have my burn-off rate. Note that this burn-off rate is a little bit steeper than this one and this particular one, so they're showing it can vary, but the big thing that's going to be a factor is the absorption rate. So on a full stomach, a much slower absorption rate, note that it peaks out closer to 50 in this particular example. And again, the sort of how quickly it's going down, that's my burn-off rate. And if we'll assume in this class that it's about 0.015%. So the blood alcohol concentration, or BAC, is something we refer to a lot, and that's this general measure of how much is in the blood. And again, remember we said that that's equal to what's in the brain. The brain is where it's doing its effects. And it turns out it's also proportional to the amount of alcohol content found in the breath, but there's a whole lot less of it. There's a proportionality factor, and we'll talk about that in a separate section. Our current legal measures for drunk driving in the United States is a blood alcohol concentration of 0.08%, which equals 0.08 grams of alcohol per 100 milliliters of blood. That's also 80 milligrams per deciliter, if anybody in the biology field cares. So this is what we're going to be using. Again, this is what we'll sort of see as being our drunk classification. So how much time would it take to be sober? This ends up being a very effective way doing these calculations at trying to understand how alcohol affects the body. So you would divide the peak blood alcohol content by the burn-off rate to determine how long from the peak time to complete sobriety. So if I have a lower blood alcohol content peak of 0.08%, and a higher burn-off rate of 0.020%, remember we said we'll use about 0.015, this would be 4 hours. But if I had a lower burn-off rate of 0.01%, and I started at a higher blood alcohol content of 0.20%, that's seriously high, that would be 20 hours. So almost a day to fully eliminate it from the system. So these sort of ranges help us understand the effects of alcohol. So how does then alcohol get into our body and our breath? Remember, we talk about this circulatory system. This is sort of referring to this distribution system. So we have a closed circulatory system, and we talked about how that alcohol comes in through the stomach and then through the small intestines. That's in our circulatory system, our digestive system, and then that's going to enter into the bloodstream. The bloodstream is the circulatory system. So it comes out, we're going to the heart in vein. So wherever it would dump in, it would go to the heart in a vein. The heart would pump, which helps push it out. It pumps it to the lungs, where it exchanges CO2 for oxygen. And it's also going to exchange a little bit of alcohol at that process. And then it moves back to the heart, gets pumped again, and goes out through the body. So it comes into the heart, pump, goes through the lungs, gets some oxygen, pumps again, goes through the whole body. So in part of this process, it's getting pumped through the liver, right? The liver would be on that final run. So it enters the bloodstream, goes to the heart. From the heart, it pumps once. It's going to go to the lungs, exchange some gases, come back to the heart, get pumps again, goes all throughout the body, including the liver. So here's kind of a picture of it. And again, this is kind of talking about the right artery and the ventricles and the aortas and different things. We just need to understand the general idea. It goes into the heart. So here would be, I arrive and it's in the heart. It gets into the bloodstream, comes in through a vein, goes into the heart. It gets pumped to the lungs, exchanges some gases, comes back to the heart, gets pumped again, and now it goes through the whole body. So again, we said when we get to the lungs, there's this general process at which the carbon dioxide our body has made gets exited out and it gets exchanged for oxygen, which our body needs. We call this respiration. And when that's happening, as the carbon dioxide is leaving and getting put into the breath, so is some alcohol. So that's what we see happening here. And this is sort of the breakdown of the very specifics. We just need to understand the generic idea that some of the alcohol in the blood leaves with the carbon dioxide and gets into the breath. But it would be a small amount. Alcohol is liquid and carbon dioxide is a gas. But we also know if you put rubbing alcohol, which is not the kind we drink, on a tabletop, it will evaporate and some of it will turn into gas, and that's what's happening.